Hi, Alistair Chapman here, and second of my Northern Lights expedition blogs. Apologise for the picture quality of the blog just being shot with an action cam here. It should look reasonably good, but nothing fancy video-wise here. So, how has the first part of this trip gone? Well, it's been very, very interesting to say the least. Our journey started off in the middle of the most horrendous snowstorm and blizzard, and it was quite an adventure. Roads were borderline as to whether we could get through them, lots and lots of snow, and then the journey on the snow scooters was particularly challenging up to our location in the remote cabins that we go to. Got stuck many, many times, as you can see in this footage, having to dig and push to get the snow scooters out. Then we get to the cabins in the middle of a snowstorm, very poor visibility and really quite horrendous. I chose to set up a camera on one of the hills overlooking the cabins to shoot time-lapse of the snow at night going over the cabins. And it was actually a bit of a shock when I played the footage back and had a look at it to actually see that the Northern Lights did actually come out in the middle of the snowstorm. But we were inside sheltering from the weather. And as a lesson learnt there is that, if you get snowstorms, snow showers, you get breaks in the cloud, and the Northern Lights can come out and be visible even in those sorts of conditions. So we'll keep an eye out for that. Now, that time-lapse sequence, for your information, was done using a Sony A6300. The shots were done by using a simple controller to fire the trigger. Very simple, actually. The camera was set to continuous shooting, and then a remote trigger was locked down and the exposure set to 2 seconds. So every 2 seconds the camera would take a photograph, and then because the trigger switch was effectively locked down by the trigger remote, it would then just take another photograph because it's in continuous shooting mode. So no need for any fancy controllers. The lens that was used was a 20mm Sigma lens on a Speed Booster Ultra. So the lens is f1.8, and then you have the benefit of the Speed Booster Ultra making it even faster. And the ISO was 3200 ISO. So 3200 ISO, 2 second exposure, 20mm f1.8 lens on a Speed Booster Ultra A6300 is how that sequence was done. But then the second night, we had much better weather. We had breaks in the cloud, predominantly clear skies, and we got a really amazing aurora. The problem, though, was the aurora only lasted like that for about 3 minutes. Fortunately, I had one camera running time-lapse. Again, it was the Alpha 6300, doing a shot exposure of 1.6 seconds at 3200 ISO. And that camera captured this sudden outburst in the aurora. It was shooting raw, so these are the time-lapse sequences made up from the processed raw images, and it coped really, really well with the huge change in exposure from virtually total darkness with a very, very faint aurora to an incredibly bright aurora. And then at the same time I was able to video a little bit of the aurora with the A7S, and for that I had the 20mm Sigma art lens, f1.4 lens. Now that's this lens here. I'm actually having some problems with this lens, to be honest. It's a brand new lens, but there is obviously some moisture inside the body of this lens, and when I take it out into the very, very cold, and we've had down to -32 on this trip so far, so really cold, I get a tiny dot of condensation just here in the middle of the lens, inside the lens, and there's nothing I can do to clear it. So right now what I'm doing with this lens is I'm trying to keep it warm. It's sitting on the heater in my hotel bedroom. I've been warming it up with the hairdryer here to really try and warm it up to try and drive that moisture out so that for the second part of the trip I don't have that problem. We also had a dinner inside a Lavu, very smoky tent. Really nice time, great evening. And we also had some really brilliant, bright, sunny weather on the last couple of days, and did some time lapses of sunrise and things like that, again with the A6300. In fact, the A6300 has tended to be my main camera that I've used so far on this trip. The A7S is always kind of on standby, ready for video opportunities to video the aurora for the real low-light video stuff where it works exceptionally well. And then the A6300 has been working really, really well as my time-lapse camera. Now, one thing that I like to do when I'm shooting time-lapse with these cameras, because I'm shooting thousands of frames every night, On one night, I shot close to 10,000 still frames, 1 second exposures when the Aurora is bright, so the camera is just constantly taking pictures, is to use the silent shooting mode, because that stops you wearing out the mechanical shutter. So the mechanical shutter doesn't work when you're doing that. There's less wear on the camera, so the camera's going to last longer, and it allows me to get very, very similar shots. The only downside, I think, to using silent shutter is a slight reduction really in dynamic range. But for the low light, nighttime stuff, that really isn't a big issue. Other challenges we've had in this trip, well, the power supply, the electricity up at the cabins is very erratic. It's a hydroelectric plant, and the power supply on my MacBook gave up. So I've just been into town to buy a new power supply for that. Minus 32, really challenging on batteries and things like that. And what's interesting there is that the small cameras, A6300 cameras like this, I've got a battery grip on this, so I can put 2 batteries in it. Makes it last much, much longer. But even so, the small camera doesn't really retain any heat, so it gets cold very, very quickly. The lenses ice up, you get frost on the lenses. So these are quite challenging to use when it's below about minus 24. There's a big drop in battery power below about minus 24. And you can hear the wind howling outside. It's really unpleasant outside right now. So the FS5, the other camera I'm using here, it's a bigger camera body and bigger batteries as well, but that does tend to retain the heat a little bit better, so it keeps running for longer. And also something else, if you leave these cameras outside, if you've got enough batteries to keep changing batteries, if you can leave the camera switched on, even if it's just taking photos or something like that, it will not get quite so cold. So those batteries do last a bit longer than a camera that's just left outside, turned off, and getting very, very cold indeed. So that's it for now. More coming later. I hope you enjoyed the few little short clips in here, and I'll catch up with you again after the second half of this trip. Bye bye for now.